In Grand Rapids. This afternoon you'll hear from City Manager Mark Washington, Police Chief Eric Payne, and Director of Oversight and Public Accountability Brandon Davis. Without further ado, I'll hand it over to City Manager Washington.
Thank you. I'm going to ask if Chief Payne and Mr. Davis will also accompany me here with safe social or physical distancing, of course. That's good. Can you touch? Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. Today is a very important day as we continue to move our community forward in light of the recent events that have occurred not only in our community but all over the world. Our community shares in the international frustration that has resulted by the senseless murder of George Floyd and the conversations around systematic and institutional racism that continues to exist. We know that we have a lot of work to do to undo racism and inequalities in the United States, and we know a lot of that work has been done here in this community. We have done a lot of great things. We've adopted a strategic plan with a very intentional equity lens. We've also implemented training for all of our departments and leaders, and we've revised policies within the police department to include the way that we interact with youth or the way that we police our community with foreign nationals or immigrants to focus on safety and not status, the way that we've ensured that crime is not reported with a bias base, as well as creating the Office of Oversight and Accountability to help the police department with transparency, as well as our equity office, hiring a new police chief that broke the glass ceiling of diversity and created second shift community officers, as well as updating our human rights ordinance and publishing our policies online that allows more transparency with our body cameras. This has all been done, co-created with community and great work by staff, and certainly with leadership from our elected leaders. But even as we realize, given where we are today, is not enough. I have heard from our community members and their desire to make more progress and make such progress expediently. And we recognize the need to embrace change in places where it may have made us comfortable. I continue to have these conversations with the police chief, our oversight office, as well as our men and women in law enforcement who continue to bravely serve this community in the face of great danger. But likewise, I also understand the sensitivity towards the members of our community who themselves have occasionally been faced with danger, and sometimes not from members who are not from law enforcement, but from law enforcement themselves. This is something that we will not tolerate as a country nor as a community. And I stand today saying that we are bringing forward proposed changes and improvements that continues the good work of our police department. And comparatively, our community is much different than many other communities around this country in terms of our reactions to much of the civil unrest, as well as our law enforcement. We have obviously not had all perfect interactions with our community, but we by and large have many more respectful interactions than some. Having said that, zero tolerance is a standard for any actions that are disrespectful to our community members. So therefore, today, I want to share with you several things that I have announced and directed our police chief, our oversight office, as well as our equity office to assist. I want to thank the mayor and all of our commissioners for their support. I look forward to having dialogue and conversation with them this upcoming Tuesday at our commission meeting, and as you know, that we also have a town hall meeting that we have tonight where we will further share this with community and entertain any questions that they might have. The dialogue and the feedback from our commissioners and even our department in helping to improve the way that we police has been invaluable. The first thing I want to share with you is that I have directed the police chief to create policies that will, between now and the next 60 days, that will improve our use of force policies and the way that we police, and explicitly banning chokeholds. The department has never endorsed this as a practice. I've spoken with the chief and several members of his command staff that said that has not been a tactic that has been trained, but we will make sure that we expressly prohibit that in our policies. We also want to improve the way that we escalate with officers and making sure that they have make sure they announce when possible and communicate with their subjects, and making sure they have the appropriate distance and whenever they can to minimize the use of force. The chief will speak more to this shortly. We also want to require officers to give verbal warnings in all situations where they have to use deadly force. That is a practice that we train on. We're going to make sure that our policies are expressly clear on that. And in some instances, of course, when officers are under very critical hostile situations where fire is being initiated, those warnings obviously may look and feel a lot differently than when they're not being in those critical incidents. We expect officers to exhaust all reasonable alternatives before using lethal force and use less lethal force options. The chief will talk more about that. We also want to make sure it's real clear that we do not condone shooting at moving vehicles. That is not a practice that we train upon nor we expect. However, the chief will talk about instances when it may or may not occur. We also have heard the narrative around the country as well as locally about making sure that officers are transparent, and that is our practice. I think what I've heard is some complaints about officers in the community over the past week or so, particularly when they were in response, emergency response, that may have not always been identified when they were responding to the civil unrest. We are looking into that and seeing what has happened, but I do know that many officers were called off from their own time. Many have come from weddings, but we want to make sure that as a practice that moving forward that they are able to identify themselves at all times whenever they're in uniform and on duty. I have asked the Oversight Office to continue the review comprehensively of all the reports that have been made. I just want to be clear, I've been here a little over a year and a half, and I have not asked for one study to occur on the police department. Not brought in a consultant to study. The studies that were initiated had already occurred prior to my arrival, but what you'll note as what you've seen from the list of things that we've done, we have been about implementation. But having said that, I know that lots of great work and lots of studies have occurred, some at the request of even community members, some at the request of management, and what we want to do is give an accountability of all the studies, the recommendations, the status of all of that work, and our Oversight Office is working very diligently to move that forward and get us a report in the next 30 days. We also talked about making structural changes in the police department consistent with the deployment study. This is something that we are happy to continue. This has been a little challenging this year. We're in the middle of not only a global pandemic, but also this national moment of civil unrest, but also economic contraction. So we're in the middle of a recession. So resources are very, very strained. And we, as many of you know, we had to make sizable adjustments in our budget, and we hope that that will be enough with the elimination of about $22 million. But having said that, we still try to find ways to redeploy officers. We deployed both police officers and firefighters to assist in the response with our homeless community without adding an additional position to the budget. But we're also going to look at finding other ways to improve in areas where we know the police department needs to get additional resources. Communications, there's not a civilian trained person to help in the department's communications. We have a sworn officer. They do a great job with the resources that we have, but we know that we can improve upon the way that we if we had someone embedded as a civilian in that department, as well as perhaps we've talked about having administrative staff to assist the chief with some of the administrative details in the department. So those are some of the things that we will be looking forward to doing as we continue the deployment study. We committed earlier this week to establish a police advisory council that provides feedback to the chief and the city on how to police. Will also be heavily involved. I've asked for appointments. I've asked Mr. Davis to provide three names, and the chief to provide three names, and for those members to get together in that group to assist in identifying additional people that will be provide another venue for the police chief to have community voice, community lens as he makes decisions regarding his department. We've also know that this is not just a policing issue, and there is the need to make sure that we look at all the societal factors that contribute to encounters with law enforcement, and we know that there are very many other socioeconomic factors, a lot of them dealing with poverty and housing, particularly with interactions with youth. And I want to be very intentional this summer and work with our area businesses to try to aggressively employ youth in our community. And I am not ready to unveil that number, but it will be exponentially greater than the number that we had last year. And hopefully by the end of the week we can have more conversations around what that looks like in a very robust youth summer employment program. We know that we have a lot of amenities that are not open for our kids. We just want to make sure that they're age, and as well as that we help with economic equality as much as possible. This is in addition to the other great work that we're doing with economic development and helping small businesses as well as job creation. But this is challenging as we find ourselves in the middle of this economic recession. We also want to continue to collaborate with other community organizations and make sure that they assist in providing awareness and support outside the organization. We're going to do training with our employees, but there's a lot of awareness and training that has to occur with us creating allies around the need to promote social justice. I don't think I mentioned earlier the other expectation of officers and their duty to intervene if they see something that is being done inappropriately by a member of the city or a member of the department. That expectation is not only for police officers but for all employees. If they see something, they should say something and report it. But we're asking for officer cooperation just like the officers are asking for community cooperation if they see something wrong. And I think that's consistent with how we train and have trained in the past, and the chief can speak more about that. I'll just highlight a few others and ask the chief forth and comment. We're going to continue to partner with other organizations in trying to increase the diversity of our department. We know that the more people that we can have inside the police department that's reflective of the community, the better it is for our community. We know that with diverse voices and diverse views, there's always better outcomes. And so the chief is agreeing with not only our internal resources from our HR department, equity office, oversight office, but to have a more effective engagement with school district, our community colleges, universities, to make sure that we can increase outcomes. So these are but a few of the things that that we're doing now. There are other things that have been requested. I know that you have others. There's petitions going around for some of the good work from Urban Core Collective, NACP, as well as Link Up about asking us to do some additional things. Some of them I've mentioned, but there are other things that are going to require a lot more vetting and consideration, such as the request to open up our labor negotiations to the public. This is something that I cannot unilaterally decide. No one up here can do, no elected official can do from the dais. These are contractual and labor issues, and at this point our belief is that both parties, both union and management, must agree for like that to occur, and we have contracts in place till 2022, so those negotiations may not be happening anytime soon, but we will certainly endeavor to make the labor unions aware of that request. The other request I know that the has asked about is the expansion of our subpoena power among our Civilian Appeal Board, and I have asked our City Attorney, Ms. Hitchcock, who is here, is available for any comments that she cares to have on the matter, to opine on that legally, as well as the request on the status of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. We are in conversations with them. They have an ongoing investigation, and I will defer any comment on that to our City Attorney as well. We've also received questions from some members, I think, who represent themselves as being part of the people's budget, about defunding the police department. We've gotten lots of letters about dismantling the police department. I think that commentary is an extension of what we've seen in other parts of the country, where there was aspiration but not a lot of strategy behind it, enough for us to really see how it's been done in a mid-sized or large-sized city at this point. I know that there's been some shifting of funding, and we've done that. Mr. Davis's position is funded out of the police department's budget. I've asked the chief to provide additional resources to our oversight office and see if we can resource that from existing budgets. Right now, by charter, the city is obligated to fund the police department's budget at 32% of the general operating fund. And as we recently adopted our budget on May 21st, we have complied with that. The department is above that funding level, and so any deliberations or considerations around funding would require much more than my consideration over a one-week period, and will require the careful thought of our finance fiscal staff, our CFO, as well as commissioners, as we make these very serious, weighty financial policy decisions in the middle of economic contraction, as well as the call for more police resources for safety. We released yesterday some of the preliminary costs for the response over the past week since last Saturday, and that total cost now, what was preliminary around north of $400,000, is almost $2 million, and about $500,000 of that was related to overtime from various departments, not all from police. So as you can see, there is a lot of work that we have to do, and I hope that you will see that we are determined and committed to do the work that's necessary to bring forth progress, and it is work that is going to require a lot of collaboration from not only the management of our organization, the employees in the department, the leaders among our labor group, as well as the elected officials. We all have to, as well as community, we all have to find a way to do this important work together. I want to now defer to the police chief and then ask our oversight officer if he has any additional comments.
Thank you, City Manager. Unfortunately, we have to start out, again, acknowledging the murder of George Floyd, and that's a very unfortunate incident that occurred, not in this community, but it reflects on law enforcement and law enforcement across the nation. So the tragic death of George Floyd cannot be in vain. So changes have to be made across the country in law enforcement and how we're doing things. City Manager outlined a number of things. Some of the things we have already trained in, such as chokeholds. That has never been a trained technique since I've been in the department for any of us to utilize. We need to put that in the policy so it's very clear that it's not allowed. There are shooting at cars. That is not a trained technique. With all these things, I was talking to Mr. Davis before this, There are very rare exceptions where those things happen. We have to be deliberate in making sure that we review those policies so that those exceptions are understood. Very rare, though. But chokeholds are not allowed in the Grand Rapids Police Department. The loud verbal commands, we train on that constantly. It's in our training bulletins. We want to incorporate that into our use of force. So there's a lot of work to be done as a city manager. We should be able to accomplish a lot of this in the next 60 days. But it's not a one and done. We have to be diligent, make sure we're continuing listening to the community, out there looking at best practices, and laws affect how we operate. So all those things have to be taken into account, and it is my duty and obligation to make sure that we are doing those things. And I want to assure the community, the city manager, that we will do our due diligence, working with Mr. Davis, the community, and city leaders in making sure that we have the best policies, practice, tactics, and training that a police department could have. Thank you.
Good afternoon. As the chief indicated, it's important that as we begin, we acknowledge the real feelings, the outrage, the fear, the emotion associated with the murder of George Floyd. As I reflected on everything that's been going on around our nation, I remembered the conversation that my mother had with me when I began driving about making sure that when I was pulled over by the police that I was respectful and I kept my hands on the wheel and that I made sure that they knew I was not a threat. And at the time, it just seemed like that's how life went. And it was just something that I had to deal with as a black man. But the truth of the matter is that the outrage that comes from seeing and being involved in situations like that, being profiled by the police, being pulled out, it's real. It's a real feeling, and we have to recognize that feeling of our community members. But I go beyond recognizing it. I stand in solidarity with the emotion associated with it. And as the director of the Office of Oversight and Public Accountability, I recognize that my responsibility of increasing transparency and accountability is essential in making sure that we move forward. And I'm encouraged by what the city manager has brought forth today. I'm encouraged by the words of the chief, and I'm committed to making sure that we accomplish that as a city, to helping to ensure that those things occur. We have to recognize that it does take change in order for us to move forward. We have to recognize that our community is crying out, and our community is crying out as a nation. As a nation, we have to make those changes, and I'm proud to be a part of a city that has stood today to state that we are not only talking about it, we're being about it, and we're going to make sure that we have that change in Grand Rapids. Thank you.
And I'll ask the city attorney to come and comment real briefly, then I'll have closing remarks after she comes.
Thank you. Excuse me. So the law department is committed to helping or assisting the city manager, the Office of Oversight and Accountability, and the police chief to accomplish those things that they're committed to and stepping forward during these difficult times. And we're here in the community, and we want to accomplish as many of those things as we can so that we can heal and we can move forward as a healthy community. We've been asked about subpoena power. We've been requested by the Director of Oversight and Accountability to look into whether or not we can have subpoena power. We can do that. It'll take some work, legislative work, but it's something that can be done, and we're having those discussions. The other thing that we've been asked about is the proposal from the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. So we have cooperated with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Everything that they've asked us to supply, we've supplied that. We spent many hours, provided many documents. We have investigated every claim that came out of the listening session in March of 2019. We've also, where there's claims that required and it was appropriate to resolve those, we've done that, and we're currently in the process of reviewing their proposal. We're looking at it very closely, looking at it, taking a detailed review to try to see those things that that we may be committed to. If that's it. Thank you.
Okay, again, I thank you for coming, and I really appreciate the commitment from everyone who's up here, from all the employees, from all the citizens. And I see, as city manager, my responsibility is to be concerned about the welfare, the safety, the health of this community, but also the health of the employees in this organization. And I will continue to look after every member of this community to make sure it is inclusive as possible, but also I have a responsibility to look after every department in this organization. And so I can't speak to the police department like it's some other department in some other community. That is a department of the city, and those are my employees. They are no different than the employees in the fire department, no different than employees in the budget department, no different than employees in the oversight office. So I care deeply about all of our employees, but I also hold accountable all of our employees. So they're no different in terms of how we treat them from any other employees. We expect accountability. However, I am aware that there is a heightened sense of urgency that surrounds the police department that's very different from any other department that we have. And I think those know that as well. And the ones that I have talked to, the ones that I have seen, do have a desire to serve this community. And I know that you will see what we've seen today are things that we put on paper. Things will change when not only do we put things on paper, but when people's hearts and minds start to change. I'm convinced we have officers who have not only the right things on paper, but who do have the right hearts and mind and are willing to work with this community to make sure that we change it in the right way. So with that, I'll turn it over to Ms. Snow Buckner.
Thank you. Thank you, City Manager. So we're going to open it up to questions. I just ask that you tell us your name and the media outlet that you represent, just so we know who's here.
I'm Jacqueline with Wood TV. There was that viral video that prompted the internal investigation from the May 30th protest when an officer shot a canister at a protester. Has that investigation been concluded, and if so, what's the outcome?
So the chief go first.
Yep. There you are, Chief.
Yeah, to answer your question, the investigation is ongoing. What we did from that last Saturday night, we had a lot of officers, a lot of resources dedicated to the protests and the events that was even occurring after that. What I did last Thursday or Friday, I dedicated our two internal affairs investigators to only work on that case. So the investigation is ongoing. It's a priority for them. And as soon as their investigation's over, it'll be in my hands, and I'll be able to have a determination along with the internal affairs.
I'm with them live, John Tillison speaking. Chief, have you met with the community members? I know you were trying to set up some meetings, such. Did any of these recommendations today come from those, or are these separate?
They have, and as the city manager mentioned, they have come from a lot of members, organizations, emails in the community. In fact, when I'm done here, I have a group waiting for me right now to go and meet with them from last Wednesday protest rally. So we're listening. I hear people. I want to be able to communicate with them their concerns, and I think this was a big part of being able to explain what we have done so far, what we're and how we look to move forward. And it's not work that's done. So I want to engage the community as much as I can to get their input. And again, like I said, I'm meeting with a group when I'm done here.
Let me also add my affirming yes to your question and lots of engagement. And when we started last week with the town hall, we started meeting immediately after. We started doing the policy work last Tuesday with the city commission after we were doing just response and recovery, talking about what things can we do to try to improve policing outcomes. And if you recall, we only started with a list of 10 or so things. from last Tuesday. And based on the engagement that we've had, based on the additional engagement that I've had with city commissioners, meeting with them individually, based on additional engagement we've had with community members, based on the engagement that we've had with town hall meetings, and based on the calls that have come in the letters, that is what democracy is, when you have the voices of the many. And I know that there was a lot of frustration early on that just wanted us to come out and make change immediately, and we could do that, and I have no problem. But this is about being inclusive, and if we're saying we value equity and inclusion, then part of that for me is being intentional and not listening to the first voice or not listening to the last voice. But when I make a decision as city manager, I want to make as much of an informed decision as possible, and unless it is something that I have to decide on right away, I want to make sure that we give it the due diligence that's needed, because there are some decisions, once you make it, you can't walk it back. And these are such that the stakes are just too high. So I think that we have listened appropriately. We're going to do some additional listening tonight. What you might see on Tuesday may be a modification of some of the things that we said today. But we want to share these comments tonight, or our progress tonight, so that people can see this is not just about playing City Hall and having meetings just to have meetings, but we're actually trying to do policy work. Real policy work is hard. Real policy work is uncomfortable, but it's also, the reality is, we work in government. So this is not a dictatorship where one person gets to decide all the funding, everything. That we have to make this community-based, and I have accountability to elected leaders that are deserving of a policy discussion as well, that I'm sure that many of them are looking forward to on this coming Tuesday. But most of what we highlighted today that I'm able to do are operational changes, are within my charter responsibility as city manager and within the police chief's responsibility to execute as department director, as well as the oversight office.
Thanks, City Manager. I know Chief is trying to get to that meeting he talked about, so we have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, there we go. Angela McCall from Oxford. I know that you guys have listed out all of these different, lengthy list of different policies and things that you want to update as you move forward, but obviously you guys recruit a lot from police academies. And so my question for you guys is, how are you guys working with those police academies so that those new cops that come in are trained in this regard, and that there's not a disconnect between departments and the training that they're receiving before they come to you guys?
Part of MCOs, one of the things that they're trying to establish is some of the training that we would look to do that involves unbiased policing and different things like that. Once they're out of the academy, we have them 8 weeks in-house, where we go through our policies, procedures, and we provide them with ethics training. Just every training that any officer has that we have on staff now, they've received that additional training, and they're given the expectations. They have to sign off that they understand that this is what is expected of them. So that's what we do with all of our new hires that come in. We don't just take them from the academy and put them out on the street. We have them 8 weeks in-house, and then I believe our field training program is 16 weeks. They're in a year's probation, which is also part of it, where we evaluate how they're adapting to that training. And it's only after that year, if they meet the qualifications that have been set up in the academy, the training we've provided, that they meet their probation. So it's an ongoing process.